I'm Kevin Kenny, the director of Glucksman Ireland House. So we've been scheduling most of our events, our online events this year during the New York lunchtime in order to attract a broad transatlantic audience. And we're especially pleased to welcome our friends in Ireland and the UK, as well as across the United States and elsewhere. Funding to endow the Irish Institute lecture was generously provided by the Irish Institute of New York, which has been dedicated to the support and promotion of the finest in Irish culture since 1950, and has been a supporter of Glucksman Ireland House at NYU since our opening in 1993. We're especially grateful for their continued support. We're delighted to welcome our speaker this year, Professor Louise Richardson, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, who will be talking to us about Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney, as most of you know, was a great friend of Glucksman Ireland House, and his work has provided one of our main themes in public programming this semester, the recent launch of Roy Foster's book on Seamus Heaney, Nick Laird's presentation at the Tom Quinlan lecture, and of course, Professor Richardson's lecture today. So we'll have time for discussion after the lecture, moderated by my colleague, Dr. Miriam Nyhan-Gray. I'd urge you to post your comments along the way using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Don't feel you have to wait until the end of the lecture. If thoughts occur to you, please post them and Miriam will moderate a conversation. I'll be brief in my remarks as I welcome Vice-Chancellor Richardson, because we have a special guest who will be offering some opening remarks as well. A native of Ireland, Professor Richardson studied history in Trinity College Dublin before taking her PhD at Harvard, where she spent 20 years on the faculty in the government department and as executive dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Before taking up her current position in Oxford, she was principal and vice-chancellor at the University of St. Andrews. Professor Richardson has written widely on international terrorism, British foreign and defense policy, security institutions, and international relations. Her books include Democracy and Counterterrorism, What Terrorists Want, and The Roots of Terrorism. I now have the honor of introducing Andy Hamilton, the president of NYU and another great supporter of what we do in Glucksman Ireland House. And actually, one of my great pleasures during the 3 years that I've served as director here is that I have introduced Andy and Colton to the podium once each year to launch our 25th anniversary book in Ireland House, to speak at our annual gala, and to introduce the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. And so, Andy, the virtual podium is yours. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much for that introduction. And I would also like to echo Kevin's thanks to the Irish Institute of New York, and also, of course, to acknowledge Loretta Brennan Glucksman, co-founder of NYU's Glucksman Ireland House, with her late husband, Lou. I don't know if Loretta is on the call today, but Loretta, we thank you for everything you do for Ireland House. Now, Seamus Heaney was instrumental to the establishment of Glucksman Ireland House, and we have been honoring him throughout the past month with Oxford's Professor Roy Foster's discussion of his recent book on Seamus Heaney, and our own Nick Laird's presentation of this year's Tom Quinlan lecture in memory of Seamus's life and work. As many of you know, Seamus was born and raised in County Derry, and over the course of his career authored more than 20 volumes of poetry, translation, and literary criticism. He held the position of Professor of Poetry at Oxford University and is widely considered to be one of the foremost poets of the 20th century. When he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1995, it was, and if I may quote the the Swedish Academy, it was for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. Now, like Seamus, our speaker today, Louise Richardson, grew up in and was shaped by rural Ireland, the first of many parallels in their lives and careers. Both Louise and Seamus have excelled in their chosen fields and indeed have gone on to grace many of the same leading universities on both sides of the Atlantic. They worked alongside one another when they were both professors at Harvard. Louise, of course, as a distinguished political scientist, and as we heard, later director of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study. And then it was during Louise's tenure as Vice-Chancellor at the University of St. Andrews that Seamus was granted his honorary degree there. So indeed, it is only fitting that Louise is here today to present her lecture on Seamus Heaney, entitled Airs and Graces. Now, I was thrilled when I heard that Louise Richardson was chosen to be my successor as Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, and she was invested in early 2016 as the first woman in Oxford's history to hold that role. Now, any of you who know Oxford know that it is a uniquely tough place in the world of university leadership, and no one knows that better than the Vice-Chancellor. I suspect that Louise and I have scars in some of the same places. But Louise has thrived in Oxford, and she's taken the university to ever new heights of academic excellence and spectacular fundraising, despite having to deal with pesky distractions like Brexit and COVID-19. Now, I very much wish that the world was a different, safer place and that we were all able to meet in person today. But thanks to technology, Louise, I know we are all very, very happy indeed that you were able to join us. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to present to you all Professor Louise Richardson. Louise.
Thank you very much indeed. And Professor Kenny, distinguished colleagues and guests, thank you for inviting me today. I know there's something more than a little odd about one Irish person speaking about another Irish person from the UK to the US, but I think such is the times in which we live, and indeed such is the breadth of Heaney's appeal. I had been very much looking forward to speaking in person to you all last May, and in truth, to having a chance to exchange war stories with Andy. And I know that online lectures are a poor substitute, and I'll do my best. But I would also want to send greetings to Loretta Glucksman. Our paths crossed some years ago when we both served on a board of the Long Room Hub in Trinity College, Dublin. She is a wonderful supporter of all things Irish. Now, I'm deeply honored and in truth, a little surprised to have been invited to lecture on Seamus Heaney. As I'm no scholar of literature, Irish or British, I'm just one of the many, many people who admired Seamus and had enormous affection for him. This combination of admiration and affection is rare. There are many people we admire, fewer by the day it seems, and a smaller number for whom we deep affection, but the combination is unusual. Yet Seamus evoked this in people, admiration for the work and affection for the man. There are many people, poets and scholars of poetry, who can speak more knowledgeably about his work, and others, like his family, who can speak more knowledgeably about the man. I'm delighted to have been asked to speak about him at all. I knew Seamus on and off for over 30 years. It says a great deal that to everyone he was always Seamus, not Mr. Heaney, Dr. Heaney, Professor Heaney, just Seamus. He wouldn't have wanted to give himself airs. We arrived in Harvard at around the same time, the early 1980s. Two fairly impecunious Irish people out of what today might be called, but he would never have called, our comfort zone. Harvard at the time had a system loosely based on Oxbridge colleges. First-year students lived in Harvard Yard, older students live in one of 13 houses. The university sought to create an intellectual life in the yard and the houses by having a few academics or graduate students live amongst the students. For a foreigner, unsure of their financial stability, this was a great gig. You got free room and board, had no transport or utility costs, and you lived a stone's throw from Widener Library. Seamus lived in Adam's house, I lived in the yard. I knew Seamus was in Adam's house. I'd probably heard through a family connection, as I have a cousin, Thomas Kinsella, who's a poet. But with typical Irish reticence, I was not about to approach him. I had an American friend, however, who lived in Adam's house, who had no such reticence. He told Seamus about me and arranged for us to meet. Thus began our unlikely friendship. Seamus was about 20 years older than us, but once a week, we would go out to a local pizza joint, Bertucci's, where they had a bocce alley. We would play bocce, drink beer, and experiment with different types of pizza. I always remember Seamus asking, "Do you think anchovies go well with pineapple? Will we try?" We did, and they do. We would then repair back to my student rooms in Harvard Yard. By way of a couch in the living room, I had a single bed with cushions at the back and no frame. Seamus would always sit on the couch, and as the night wore on, the mattress would gradually slide off the base towards the floor, but we would keep talking about Harvard, about America, about Ireland, and about books. For hours after he'd left, I would walk my room, remembering the turns of phrase, the use of language, the layers of meaning in simple sentences that Seamus threw out casually as we whiled the evening away. Brilliant, friendly conversation can be nourishing in the same way as poetry. It can be the rain that makes your own thoughts grow and change and ripen. Talking with Seamus was a joy that long outlasted those playful bocce evenings. It was inspiring. And in talking about Seamus this evening, I would especially like to reflect on the ways in which his life and work continue to offer inspiration. Seamus would spend the spring semester at Harvard every year and would count the days until the spring break when he could return to Mary and the kids. It was an uncomfortable and lonely existence. One year the family came and they rented a house off Kirkland Street and he seemed more at ease. But I never felt he was completely relaxed at Harvard, even later when he was most celebrated. He was always anxious to get home. He served semester-long stints as Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory until 1995, when, thanks to the Nobel Prize, he didn't need to do it anymore. He became instead the Ralph Waldo Emerson Poet in Residence, meaning he stayed for only a week or so. He took the post, he told me, to keep other universities at bay. In the course of his time at Harvard, Seamus went from being a little-known poet in the 80s to a major celebrity in the 90s. His later lectures were mobbed with what were known as teeny boppers, and he was besieged with requests for talks, opening, endorsements, and Irish events of all kinds. The Irish of Boston were delighted that one of their own had finally conquered the Anglo bastion of Harvard. He had an acute sense of personal obligation to both people and institutions and agonized about many of these requests. He talked to me about some of them. What to do when a prominent Irish American asked his endorsement of a very bad book, or when the Houghton Library wanted to buy his papers. He felt the papers belonged in Ireland, but also considered himself under an obligation to Harvard because of the university's generous hospitality over the years. As he became more famous, I slipped into the background, never presuming on a relationship with him. But if he ever caught a glimpse of me at the back of a lecture theatre, he'd welcome me as an old friend. I carry so many memories of individual sentences as if he said them this morning. Seamus came to my rooms in Harvard Yard to celebrate my MA in June 1984. He looked at the spread on the table and said with a smile, "Cucumber sandwiches, no less." An innocent enough comment, but clearly conveying in the gentlest way that it was far from cucumber sandwiches in Harvard Yard that he and I were both reared. As the years went on, the graduate student gang dissipated, and he embraced my husband and visited us in our home, where we had a real catch. He understood that having married a doctor, in my parents' eyes, I had reached the pinnacle of success. On one occasion in 1994, he arrived and said, "Expecting company, I see," to which I replied, "Yes, Bill and Andy and Beth, the old graduate student gang, are on their way." He smiled and was, as ever, too polite to point out my stupidity, but he was alluding to the fact that he had noticed I was pregnant. That pregnancy turned out to be a very difficult one, as I had cancer at the time. As I was going into hospital, he sent me a beautiful block print of the poet's chair, with an even more beautiful inscription about being here for good in every sense. His generosity with his time and his words was extraordinary, and can only have put an enormous strain on those closest to him, who had to share him with the world. In thinking about this lecture, I pulled down from my shelves some of his books of poetry, only to find that several were gifts from him with beautiful inscriptions. Tom and I invited him to our wedding in America in 1988, but he was in Ireland at the time. Rather than simply completing the enclosed reply card and returning it in the pre-addressed envelope, as anyone else would have done, he wrote 2 beautiful letters, one to my parents and one to Tom's, none of whom he'd ever met. Seamus severed his formal ties with Harvard in 2006. I did in 2008. We met again in Dublin and in Scotland. At his home in Sandymount, the same house that he had bought on a lecturer's salary in 1976, you caught a glimpse of the weight of this conscientious, courteous man as the postman delivered mountains of requests, to each of which he felt compelled to respond. He repaired to a cottage in Wicklow to write. While Seamus had a longer association with Harvard than any other university, he was not of Harvard, and I don't think he ever felt entirely comfortable there. While he had many friends there and everywhere, his connection always struck me as entirely pragmatic. He needed the income to sustain himself and his family, but he needed to be at home in Ireland to compose poetry. In his entire time at Harvard, he wrote only 2 poems, both in response to specific requests from the university and quite early in his tenure. One, Villanelle for an Anniversary, was composed for the university's 350th anniversary celebrations in 1986. The 19-line Villanelle, with its unmistakable evocation of a bell ringing, has 2 repeated lines. "A spirit moved, John Harvard walked the yard." And "The book stood open and the gates unbarred." The latter has always been for me the essence of a university, with books and gates open to all comers. The other Harvard poem was Alphabets, composed for the Phi Beta Kappa literary exercises in 1984. He explained that traditionally the Phi Beta Kappa poem is about learning, so his was about making the first letters at primary school. There he draws smoke with chalk the whole first week, then draws the forked stick that they call a Y. This is writing. The poem is, of course, about much more than learning to write. It's about recognizing the visible world in the shape of language, and about, as Helen Vendler put it, widening the gaze. The scholar encounters first English, then Latin, Old Irish, and finally Greek, with different shaped letters, lambdas, deltas, and omegas, which resonate with the familiar childhood shapes of corn sheaves, potato pits, and horseshoes. Vendler sees this as implying that when many languages are known, the heart's sympathy may widen, even to include the whole world, a world seen from the astronaut's window as a familiar vowel, the risen, aqueous, singular, lucent O. This is surely true. But alphabets also implies that language is something we can find anywhere. It is like a forked stick, something we already have in our hand, even before we are educated to point it as a tool, as a divining rod, or as a letter in the alphabet. The poem reinforces, as all Heaney's poems do, that poetic language belongs to everyone. It is not a narrow matter of erudition, but a broader one of recognition, of seeing things. The stick, which is also writing, is a means of reaching out into the world. As he wrote in his beautiful poem, A Hazel Stick for Catherine Anne, the stick might be cut from your family tree. And the evening I trimmed it for you, you saw your first glowworm. All of us stood around in silence, even you, gigantic enough to darken the sky. For a glowworm, and when I poked open the grass, a tiny brightening den lit the stick in the blunt cut end, lit the eye in the blunt cut end of your stick. This is the illumination of poetry. The writing as a simple act with a commonplace object, yet that reveals something extraordinary. One of the distinctive delights of Seamus's poetry is the easy connection it insists on between working the lines of the land and working the lines of language. Ploughing, digging, the tongue and groove of carpentry, the forked stick of the water diviner, the sunk bucket of a woman drawing water from a well. All of these activities are compared with writing. The result is twofold. Seamus's poetry creates an absolute sense of the dignity, even the sanctity of rural work. The rhythmic folding and unfolding the land that insists upon the community of manual labor and of life lived in daily touch with the elements, soil, water, air. There is a huge sense of respect here for Ireland's long heritage as an agrarian society, a small town society. He pays tributes in his lines to his grandfather and his father, not only to the beauty of landscape, but to those who've shaped it, day after day, by their long-born heft and toil and suffering and patience. Secondly, the writer is not set apart in an ivory tower or an Ivy League town. Instead, he is embedded, dug in to landscape, its history, its geology, its flora and fauna, its politics. This work is often sensuous, but it is also satisfyingly hard. There are stones to be lifted, graves to be excavated, grit to be swallowed. He has to keep his ear to the ground, to break ground, to find a glimpse of sky at the bottom of the deep well of the everyday. It was part of Seamus's modesty and his keen sense for Irish reality that he did not prance on the horse of the poetic knight in armor. He preferred to stay grounded. He remained true to his roots. Yet his outlook was international, linguistically curious, culturally outgoing. It's interesting that although Alphabets is about Seamus's own progress from the desks of Anna Horish School to the podium of Sanders Theatre in Harvard, he happily acknowledged that it was also inspired by his reading of a poem by the Polish-American poet Czesław Miłosz. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that Andy mentioned a moment ago, Seamus fondly recalled the wonder of first listening to the wireless as a child. I had to get close to the actual radio set in order to concentrate my hearing, and in that intent proximity to the dial, I grew familiar with the names of foreign stations. Even though I did not understand what was being said in those first encounters with the gutturals and sibilants of European speech, I had already begun a journey into the wideness of the world. At the risk of being political, but as a political scientist, I can't help myself, this outlook on the world, this deep rootedness in a place, rural Ireland, yet deep sympathy with people far beyond in both time and place, stands in stark contrast to much of what we hear today. Seamus was deeply rooted somewhere, but he was beloved anywhere. With deep roots in Ireland, he was a citizen of the world, and he knew well what citizenship meant. The question of Seamus's citizenship came to the fore with his inclusion in the Penguin Book of Contemporary British Poetry, edited by Blake Morrison and Andrew Motion in 1982. Having been born in Derry, on the northern side of a troubled border, Seamus was entitled to both Irish and British citizenship. In fact, he got a British passport before he had an Irish one. He told the story that he got a British passport when going on a pilgrimage to Lourdes. A friend told him that if he were living in the Republic of Ireland, he wouldn't need a passport, as Lourdes was part of the jurisdiction. In the late 1960s, Seamus had been included in an anthology of Commonwealth poetry and a compilation called Young British Poets, without protest. But things were different in the 80s, and he did protest his inclusion in the Penguin Book of British Poetry, albeit playfully. In his pamphlet, An Open Letter, he famously wrote, Be advised, my passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen. As he said himself, this was meant to have a bit of merriment to it. He wasn't being strident, he didn't know how, but he was characterizing a culture, Catholic Ireland, in which people did not stand to toast the Queen. He pointed out, of course, that when in a formal setting, he had always thought it was the courteous thing to do, to stand and to toast. This issue resonated deeply with me. Shortly after it was announced that I had been appointed Principal of St. Andrews, and while still living in the US, the Scottish government invited me to the Ryder Cup in Valhalla. I should have appreciated then just how important a role golf plays in Scottish society and prepared myself for what was to come, but that's another story. At the end of the formal dinner, we were asked to be upstanding for the royal toast. I was immediately seized by a range of conflicting emotions and silently recited Seamus's words to myself. My passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen, as I wondered what to do. Courtesy took over and I conformed, while asking myself if I was betraying my culture, my country, my ancestors. Had I done a terrible thing by accepting this job in Scotland? My crisis, while acute, was momentary, as the royal toast was immediately followed by the toast to the president. Not the president of the golf club, as I'd assumed, but the president of the United States, George Bush. This time I really gulped and decided that toasting the Queen wasn't so bad after all. In 1989, Seamus was elected Professor of Poetry in Oxford. Reflecting in his last Oxford lecture on an open letter and its statement about his passport being green, Seamus said that he preferred to envision the poem conferring dual citizenship. I wrote about the colour of the passport, not in order to expunge the British connection in Britain's Ireland, but to maintain the right to diversity within the border, to be understood as having full freedom to the enjoyment of an Irish name and identity within that northern jurisdiction. There is nothing extraordinary about the challenge to be in two minds. If, for example, there were something exacerbating, there was still nothing deleterious in my sense of Irishness, in the fact that I grew up in the minority in Northern Ireland and was educated within the dominant British culture. My identity was emphasized rather than eroded by being maintained in such circumstances. One can only imagine what he might have made of the recent British saga of French-manufactured new blue British post-Brexit passports. His words about dual citizenship and embracing the challenge to be in two minds have particular force now. In a world where borders and political factions are hardening, and where petty nationalism spreads fear that cultural identity may be eroded by newcomers, we need poets to remind us that being doubtful, double, Derry and Dublin can be a source of enormous cultural strength and imaginative vitality. The state that allows one to be in two minds, to have more than one tradition and identity, and to entertain the value of more than one opinion, is not politically weak. It is vibrant, inclusive, diverse. It can think laterally and bilaterally. It is not anxiously introspective and isolationist, but playfully outgoing and polyphonic. Seamus's work communicates the strength of an open hand and an open mind. My daughter Kira is far too cynical for someone her age, and like so many millennials, expects nothing from the political establishment and political life. But on the 26th of May, the day after the Irish referendum, I received a WhatsApp message from her from a coffee shop in Copenhagen that read simply, "History says don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can ride us up, and hope and history rhyme. You'll recognize, as I did, of course, the Cure of Troy." After the terrorist atrocities of September 11th, Seamus wrote, "If poetry has a virtue, it resides in its ability to bring us to our senses about what is going on inside and outside ourselves. As human beings, we crave this realization that one of the most observable proofs of such craving was the general and urgent quest in the wake of September 11th for poems that would be equal to that moment. I believe that in this time of political brinkmanship, of fearful rhetoric and angry divisions, His words are equal to our moment. They are deeply humane. His poems are, in fact, indispensable. Helpfully, he identified the quality that makes a poem so. He said, "One thing is certain. The indispensable poem always has an element of surprise about it, even perhaps a touch of the irrational. For both the reader and the writer, it will possess a soothsaying force as if it were an oracle delivered unexpectedly and irresistibly." Often his poems describe such moments of unexpected epiphany. In The Skylight, the moment when the slates come off is a small domestic miracle. Extravagant, sky entered and hell's surprise wide open. In Balnahinch Lake, it is the utter mountain mirrored in the lake, which entered us like a wedge to knock sweetly home into core timber. In that moment, something in us had unhoused itself. In Postscript, stepping out of the car along the flaggy shore of County Clare grants a dramatic view of a lake whipped up by wind and the unearthed lightning of a flock of swans. That seemingly random decision, while on a journey to make time to stop moving, to step out and expose oneself to the buffeting of the wind and the play of light, produces an emotional revelation. He wrote, "You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come as the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open." I find it significant that in all these poems, opening up is associated with gifts of self-renewal. When we are unhoused, blown open, made vulnerable, something wonderful happens. Sky enters and holds surprise wide open. We reassess, we appreciate, we are freshly exposed to the elements of ourselves. Great poetry is a skylight, a skydive, a skeleton key to free us from the coffin of cynicism and worry that too often threatens to bury us alive. As it shares this gift with all its sister arts, from painting to music, from film to dance, this gift of openness to everything, creative freedom, empathy with other beings, human and non-human, living and dead, telling new stories, the possibility of imagining things differently and better. It seems worthwhile to restate the infinite value of these practices, because we are living through a time when the humanities are under fire. In concert with a renewed political emphasis on closing down borders, detaining and deporting non-nationals, and withdrawing from previous international agreements, has come a narrowing of the syllabus that governments are prepared to support. I see these forms of anxious constriction as related and worrying developments. Music and foreign languages, for example, are no longer considered necessary elements of a state school education deserving of public funding, despite strong evidence that they promote children's psychological well-being and their learning across the curriculum. The result is that most children do not have access to private lessons. Who do not have access to private lessons are excluded from further study and careers in these subjects. Universities, too, are threatened with a future in which public funds will support only students taking degrees related to science and technology. There is talk of arts degrees being worth less when the high costs of university tuition are computed against the graduate salary students can, on average, expect to earn. The implication of this grimly utilitarian rhetoric is that the arts are luxuries. They are dalliances for the children of the rich, extras, as dance lessons once were in the curriculum of Victorian young ladies. As a society, we cannot afford them. The needs of the individual and the community are better served by learning that leads more directly to a quick buck. Seamus would strongly have repudiated this view. In fact, in Britain, books do make bucks. The creative economy is estimated to contribute a net value of more than £101 billion to Britain's GDP. It is vital to the economic health of the sector that diverse talent is not lost because the most gifted young writers, actors, musicians, dancers, and artists of the future, supremely gifted as Seamus was, never found their calling or lived in the wrong zip code to be able to respond. But when we demean the arts, we stand to lose something more profound. The humanities may have been reconceived as a business, but it remains their true business to make us reconceive our humanity. As Seamus so eloquently argued, poetry and the arts fortify your inner life. Listening together and knowing things together is what a culture is. He also said, the poet is on the side of undeceiving the world. An echo perhaps of W.H. Auden's assertion that the primary function of poetry, as of all the arts, is to make us more aware of ourselves and the world around us. I am quite certain it makes us more difficult to deceive. So I say, yes, we need STEM subjects. But to follow the organic metaphor through, we also need flower subjects, film and fashion design and fine art, law, languages and literature, oratory and opera, world history, ethics, epistemology, and religion. We need to stay open to cross-pollination, to bloom as a society that is more than its economy, as a nation that is more than one nation. Poetry is part of how we stay open, how we recognize our shared vulnerability as a strength, how we admit the world. Seamus's poetry has in this regard, as he did, an irresistible charm. On his tombstone in Balahi is written a line from one of his poems, "Walk on air against your better judgment." It's a line that brings a smile and a tear. How often in recent times have we needed the admonition to try to be light, to find light, while facing heavy realities? Yet we must do our best to let his words breathe joy and curiosity into us, inspiring us with a lighter heart and a determination to look outward, to open up to the euphoria of living and breathing, despite our anxieties and misgivings and lockdowns. One of Seamus's many obituaries in the Belfast Telegraph reported locals saying approvingly that he talked like a farmer's son. He was down to earth. He had no airs and graces. I would have to agree with the first assertion. He was of the earth, earthy. His voice warm and unaffected. He had no airs, but grace he had in lyrical abundance. I met Seamus again in Scotland when he came to the poetry festival Stanza in March 2010. He had cut down on engagements by then, but was still receiving invitations from all over the world. He explained that he had not gone to Venice because you are there to decorate the program, a celebrity, but had come to Fife because of connectedness to the place and to the many poets that he counted among his friends. He came back to St. Andrews again in June 2013 to give a reading of some of his poems which are inspired by medieval literature. The reading was part of a conference called The Middle Ages in the Modern World, convened to celebrate the 600th anniversary of the university. It took place on the same day as graduation, when he sat in the audience and cheered on his friend Mary McAleese as she was awarded an honorary degree. He gave his talk in a modern, very un-medieval lecture theatre and was introduced by the organizer, Chris Jones. Chris had been very keen to get Seamus to the conference and tried to get me to use my friendship with Seamus to encourage him to accept, which I was very loath to do. Chris told the story in his introduction of Seamus. As we drove back to my house after the lecture, the fact that we drove rather than walked along the seafront, itself an indication that he had slowed down. Seamus said how glad he was that Chris had told that story. He had thought about doing it himself, but didn't want to give himself airs. I remember laughing out loud and telling him that he was the only person on the planet who could possibly imagine that acknowledging the friendship between us raised his status more than it did mine. But he was like that, deeply Irish in his reluctance to seem self-important or bunctious, though the world was happy to lay laurels at his feet, knowing that he had earned them. He and Mary stayed with us a couple of days, and when they left, he gave us an inscribed illustrated print of a drink of water. It ends with the lines, "Where I have dipped again, to be faithful to the admonishment on her cup. Remember the giver fading off the lip." He gave us all so much. His death 2 months later, to quote his devastating line from Proscript, caught the heart off guard. It was too soon. He should have been celebrating his 81st birthday this year. It would always have been too soon to lose his genius, his gentle heart, his gracious spirit. But he has left us words on the cup, a taste of well water, a gift, a benediction. I thank him from the depths of my heart, and I'm grateful to all of you for allowing me to share some of my memories of him with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor Richardson. I only wish that we were in person with you to give you a round of applause for that. That was beautiful, poignant, straddled the academic and the personal in such an inspirational way. Thank you so much. And I know our co-founder and the chair of our board, Loretta Brennan-Glucksman, who managed to overcome wobbly Wi-Fi to get on the call, has so enjoyed this lecture today. Thank you ever so much. I'd like to take this opportunity to Vice-Chancellor, if we could pose a few questions to you, if
Sure,
that's
of course.
And I think I'm going to defer to our colleague, the Professor of Anglo-Irish Literature at UCD in Dublin, Margaret Kelleher, who's emailed in a question. And I think, Vice-Chancellor, towards the end of your lecture there, you touched on this a little bit, but it's no harm. I think we all need some optimistic thoughts at the moment. And Margaret's question is, in light of contemporary challenges to the status of the humanities in university contexts, are there words or actions from Seamus that keep us optimistic?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, well, his notion of the indispensability of poetry, the way we turn to poetry after atrocities, the way he inspires us all in this people throughout the world. I think it's an extraordinary irony that in Britain, at any rate, most of the academics who are saying that the value of a degree is linked to a graduate salary, themselves were educated in the humanities in the university Andy and I share. So I think his whole work is an assertion of the power and the importance of humanities, not just to help us get through difficult times, but to inspire us always, but to also indirectly to influence our view on policy. I mean, he had the most open-minded view of the other. He didn't believe in the other. He was always open to others. So translating that into policy, although he would, he shied away from doing that directly, it's very clear to see what policies he would have advocated. But he would certainly have been a staunch advocate for investing in the humanities, investing in foreign languages, which he learned in a tiny little rural school, which I learned in a tiny little rural school, and which are not being taught in tiny little rural schools today. And that's a terrible shame. But his whole work, I think, is a statement of optimism.
I've another question, congratulating you on your insights to Seamus, and then Irish Americans exist easily in two minds. Do you think Seamus made it easier for the Irish in Britain to do that kind of straddling, would you say?
I think he would never have claimed to do that. And of course, because there are so many Irish in Britain and always have been. I mean, it is remarkable that he conquered the two I'll get into trouble with Andy if I say this, but I was going to say the two most famous academic institutions in America and Britain, Oxford and Harvard. Andy would argue, of course, it was Yale, but as an Irishman, and as very much always an Irishman, did he make it easier for, I think it's really very easy for Irish people to exist in Britain. Probably always has been. Fergal Keane at the moment, incidentally, is working on a TV series or a radio series on how the Irish made Britain, which I think is a slightly triumphalist claim that Seamus wouldn't make. Seamus was happy to be both, and he talked about his, the fact that he was Irish in a British jurisdiction made him was richer than being one or the other. So did he make it? He contributed, I'm sure, to the ease of being Irish in Britain, but he wouldn't make a claim to be responsible for it because I think it predated him.
I agree. I knew him only a tiny bit, but I absolutely agree with your assessment on that. Vice-Chancellor, Kevin Kenny, our director, has asked, and apologies, Kevin, if you didn't want me to single you out in saying it. His question was, where did Seamus feel most at home, do you think?
Seamus was such a family man. I mean, whenever you talk to him, he talked about his children. He was utterly devoted to them. I think he felt most at home in County Wicklow. That's where he had his cottage he repaired to all the time. I don't doubt he felt at home in Derry too, but or in Balahi more than even than Derry. But I think he made Wicklow his home, I would say. Even though he stayed in the same house in Sandymount from 1976 to when he died, Sandymount in Dublin. But he went off to this little cottage to write, and he had turned the attic into where he wrote, and I think that's where he was most at home. But he would probably say where his family were, and his family were all in Ireland, of course, and stayed there.
It always struck me, Vice-Chancellor, I grew up in Wicklow, and my father worked in the forestry for a long time and knew a lot of locals who knew him, not as Seamus Heaney, the Nobel laureate and the poet, but just as a neighbor and friend. And it always struck me as to the esteem in which he was held locally, because in Ireland, we're very good at knocking our own, especially when you enter the stratosphere that Seamus did, but he was held in the same esteem in the locality as he was in, the halls of Harvard and Oxford and everything in between. So,
if I could just, as you say, the Irish are very good at knocking their own, at any who make progress. But the worst that anybody could say about Seamus was they would call him famous Seamus, and that was the most negative thing I ever heard about him in my life, and it's not negative. Famous Seamus.
We've just a note here on behalf of the officers and members of the Irish Institute of New York, and we'd like to thank you for being the 13th speaker in our annual partnership with Glucksman Ireland House. The Irish Institute is a very important component of what we do, and our lecture is one of the high points. So thank you. Marion Casey posted that note. One other question that came in, Vice-Chancellor, we've a little bit more time. I want to, if it's okay with you, keep you on with us as long as we can. Seamus solicited both admiration and affection to an extraordinary extent, and not all writers do. I guess implicitly you've touched on this, but do you have any personal opinions as to why he did and maybe others do not to the same extent?
Oh, I think it was a function of his extraordinary personality. He was such a kind, generous, modest man, and that's not true of all artists or writers. He was a deeply affectionate person. I mean, he had many, many friends. I think it was by dint of his personality. I mean, if he had never been a poet, everyone who knew him would have loved him, I think, because he was that kind of person. And it's a rare breed. So he was not only an extraordinarily gifted poet, but he was an extraordinary human being. completely independent of the poetry. You know, just one, you know, extraordinarily kind, considerate gesture after another. Or, you know, again, in later years, visiting him in Sandymount, and again, a modest little house and these mountains of posts coming in, and him feeling an obligation, you know, that he personally needed to respond to people. Now, Andy and I get all kinds of, well, Andy may be a nicer person than I am and respond personally to everything that comes through his door, but I can't, and most of us don't. And he didn't have an infrastructure, unlike Andy and I. He didn't have staff. It was himself in the kitchen writing handwritten responses to people, which is without complaint. I mean, he, you know, in his later years, especially after his stroke, he really did slow down and got tired. But he had such a strong sense of obligation to others. So I think it was his personality is the explanation.
And I think that we saw that in, you know, not to, you know, bring us down too much because it was so incredibly sad, but the celebration of his life when he passed was just phenomenal. Do you have any personal insights on that, Vice-Chancellor?
No, but I mean, people, you know, he stayed in our house 2 months before he died. He and Marie stayed with us. That last event was at the end of June 2013, and he died 2 months later. And so people always talk about, you know, they remember where they were when Kennedy was shot, when people landed on the moon. To me, it was when I heard Seamus died. I was in the middle of sitting next to Alex Salmon, sitting in the middle of a Council of Economic Advisors meeting, and I was just so shocked because I'd seen him so recently. It just didn't seem possible. Such a, well, as I say, caught the heart off guard is his face, which captured it so well. But again, just a real genuine outpouring of affection. And you know, again, we all, when people die, we remember their good sides and we forget their less good sides. But that wasn't the case with him. It was just genuine celebration of an extraordinary man.
Thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor. I'm going to hand over again to our director, Professor Kevin Kenny, just to close out today's wonderfully special lecture. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Louise, for such a wonderful presentation and such a meaningful one to us here at NYU Glucksman Ireland House. Thank you also, Andy, for the introductory remarks and for being here throughout the hour. It was such a, in some ways, such a touching and meaningful lecture for so many people here in the audience who knew Seamus. And thank you all once again.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Andy. Great to see you.